Hello there, welcome to Cool Talk. Today we're going to talk about one of the most evil men in all of human history, Joseph Stalin, and the rise of Russian communism. But first, a little backstory. For centuries, Russia had always been a backwards, isolated country until Peter the Great modernized it in the early 1700s. Then Catherine the Great, in her 30-year reign, further strengthened it and enlarged the territory. It was becoming a major power. Yet Russia was still backwards. They were peasants. They still had the system of serfdoms. Four czars came along back to back. Paul I, a hated tyrant, assassinated just 5 years later. Alexander I, the next czar, was charming, intelligent, attempted some reforms, but he became an authoritarian and died in 1825. Tsar Nicholas I, tyrant, bitter, and stubborn, and then his son in 1855. Alexander II tried to reform Russia, and he did end serfdom. Industry grew, he emancipated the serfs, but young people wanted faster reforms, bigger changes, and more freedom, and so it was that in 1881, Alexander II was assassinated by a bomb. And I'm going to pause right there because it was 3 years earlier that Joseph Stalin was born. Stalin was born in Gori in today's Georgia, in Russia. Now, Russia is a large land. It occupies two continents, Europe and Asia. And Georgia is part of the Asian side, the East. Stalin's father was a shoemaker who would get drunk and beat up little Stalin and his mother until Stalin's mother couldn't take it anymore, grabbed her little boy, and left. His mother's name was Ekaterine. Ekaterine worked as a house cleaner. She washed clothes. Stalin got into school. He would get into constant trouble for fighting, yet he got good grades. He would write poetry, took up drama and painting, and sang in the school choir. At 16, Stalin was enrolled in a seminary to study to become a priest. So imagine that. Joseph Stalin would have been a priest. He was there for 10 years. Now, the seminary was rough. Masses lasted 2 to 3 hours of sermons. You had to stand up the whole time. If you misbehaved, which Stalin did often, you were locked up in a room. He learned to hate authority. He became withdrawn. He got good grades, but at some point, he declared himself an atheist and left. And by this point in his life, Russia had gone through 2 more czars. Alexander III, who was repressive and wanted to undo the reforms that his father had introduced. Academic freedom was stifled, censorship was more severe, spies were everywhere, and the government turned a blind eye to religious persecution. When Alexander III died, his son, Nicholas II, would become the last czar. He became czar in 1894, and he was just as repressive as his father. He would be, as I mentioned, the very last czar. At this point, Stalin, 20 years old, began to study Marxism. He had left the seminary for good. He joined a socialist group, and he worked as a meteorologist and gained supporters as he gave classes on socialist theory. These were dangerous activities, as Tsar Nicholas had secret police who were tracking down revolutionaries throughout the nation. Stalin went into hiding, and later he joined the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. In the city of Batumi, he organized workers' strikes, and in one demonstration, protesters stormed a prison. Troops fired on the people, killing 13. Stalin was arrested soon afterward and exiled to Siberia. The Tsar continued his authoritarian policies. He clashed with the church, and in an attempt to unite the people, he used anti-Semitism and persecuted the Jews. During all of this, the peasants, of course, were very, very poor. Many were illiterate. And then wealthy landowners would block any attempts at reform in order to keep their privileges. These landowners were called kulaks. Now, in an earlier video, I described how Russia and Japan went to war due to Russia's expansionist policies in Korea and Manchuria. The Tsar was sure he was going to win, but to everybody's surprise, Japan began to win battle after battle after battle until finally Russia had to negotiate a peace treaty, mediated by the American president Theodore Roosevelt, who won a Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. And for Russia to lose against little Japan was humiliating. January 1904, Stalin escapes from Siberia and arrives at Tiflis, Georgia. Tiflis today is known as Tbilisi. He joined a Marxist group, and the Russian socialist movement at this point had divided itself into two factions, the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. Stalin joined the Bolsheviks. January 1905, thousands of peaceful protesters marched to the Winter Palace with a petition for the Tsar. Troops blocked the street as they got near. The crowd stopped. The troops opened fire. Dozens were killed. The official number is 92 dead. That was a turning point for most people. The Tsar, they felt, didn't care about them, and so unrest followed, and it would continue. So Stalin intensified his work as an organizer, and he was a very, very good one. Now, Stalin, I have to mention, didn't speak Russian. He spoke Georgian. Russia is a huge land with parts, as I mentioned, with land that reaches across the continents of Europe and Asia. It was a very backwards place. 90% of the women and 2/3 of the men couldn't read. They were illiterate, superstitious. 129 million people, and well over 90% of them were poor, often desperately so. The church was very repressive. So, with a repressive church and a repressive government, the phrase, "all we have to lose are our chains," was more and more prevalent. During all the protests, keep in mind that Russia, with all its diversity, it was bound to have ethnic violence, and it did. In the city of Baku, for example, the Armenians and the Azeris clashed against each other. 2,000 of them were killed. Stalin had formed a squad, as did many others. Stalin's squad would try to raise funds for the cause through racketeering and robbery. Stalin had become a gangster. Stalin went to a conference in St. Petersburg where he met the Bolshevik leader Vladimir Lenin, and Stalin saw Lenin as a mentor. As for Lenin, he approved of Stalin's criminal activities to raise revenue. And the criminal activities would intensify. Stalin would get money by any means necessary, robbing banks, holdups, businesses, even kidnapping little children. Now, in one notorious case, a convoy that was carrying millions and millions of rubles in revenue was held up by Stalin's squad. Bombs and guns were used. 40 people were killed and countless were injured. The squad got away with the equivalent of over $3 million in today's currency. In 1906, Stalin married Katos von Diez. She was from West Georgia. They had a son, Yakov, but sadly, 8 months after the baby was born, she died from pneumonia. Stalin left his baby son with his sister-in-law and pressed on. Lenin continued his movement with assistance from other leaders such as this man, Leon Trotsky. Now, Trotsky found Stalin uncouth with his Georgian accent and his rough ways. They would become enemies. The Tsar finally met with some of the resistance fighters and gave a couple of concessions, but he would always pull back. And then World War I broke out, and for the Russians, things would get much, much worse. 2 million Russians would die in World War I. As for Stalin, he was arrested several times in these years, and he would often escape. He was not a great orator. He was not imposing. He was only 5 feet 4 inches tall. But he was a great organizer and an expert in raising revenues through his criminal activities. His final arrest, he was sent to northern Siberia, north of the Arctic Circle. Escape was impossible, and the winters were 40 degrees below zero. The days were cold, monotonous, harsh, and the solitude would hinder even the toughest minds. but Stalin was sentenced to 4 years. He completed much of the sentence when suddenly in 1917, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated the throne and the rebels had won. Stalin returned home. There were 2 provisional governments that came and went before Lenin and the Bolsheviks seized control. The Bolsheviks only received a small amount of votes in the first and only free elections. So Lenin and the Red Guard dissolved the Constitutional Assembly and established a party dictatorship. The name Communist was adopted. The Tsar and his family were placed under house arrest. Back and forth they were moved from place to place. Then in July 1918, they, along with the family physician, the cook, the footman, and the maid, were all put into a room and assassinated. It went like this. They were put into the basement of the home. 7 armed men stepped inside with handguns and began shooting. Nicholas, his wife, and son were shot to death. But the 4 daughters, who were wearing jewelry sewed into their clothes, had, like you could say, a bulletproof vests in a sense. So, as they laid on the ground, the soldiers came over and bayoneted their bodies and then shot them in the head at close range. It was the last of the Romanov dynasty, the last of the Tsars. Under Lenin's leadership, all private property was abolished. All businesses placed under the control of the government, as was the banking system. The church, which was the biggest landowners in the nation, was deprived of all properties. Russia pulled out of World War I. But then a civil war broke out between Lenin and the Bolsheviks and the Red Army against the White Army, which was made up of anti-communists. This civil war would last 5 years, and 7 million people would die, including 2 million who died of starvation. In the end, the Red Army won. In 1922, Russia had become a union of federal republics, and it acquired the name the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. In 1924, Lenin became ill and died. So the Bolsheviks needed a successor. And if you look at this picture here, here is Stalin when he was young, along with Lenin and Trotsky. They were together from the very beginning. The most logical choice among the successors would have been Trotsky. Trotsky had advocated for world communism, while Stalin wanted to focus on the new Soviet Union alone. Stalin convinced the party Congress to follow his lead. So Trotsky was exiled, and in 1940, he was murdered in Mexico. Under Stalin, there was the collectivization of agriculture and heavy focus on industry. The economy recovered to pre-war levels by 1928. Now, collective agriculture means that all the farmers work together as a collective. They work with one common cause that was established by the government. Farmers did not work individually. Stalin had 5-year plans that would begin. Food rationing was introduced. Production was curtailed. Living standards, however, dropped. Now, Stalin also made a cultural war where novelists had to idealize the revolutionary leaders. Music had to be culturally understood by the masses. Historians had to glorify the nations. A lot of propaganda went out to enhance the image of Stalin and a positive look at Russia. Now, as for the kulaks who were the previous wealthy landowners, they resisted all of this. They even took steps to burn their crops and kill their livestock so as not to assist the government. Stalin had these kulaks shipped to remote lands where crops didn't grow and many of them starved to death. Stalin introduced a lot of propaganda attacking the church. Now, the Cathedral of Christ the Savior, which took 40 years to build, was demolished by Stalin. A government building would be built in its stead. That never happened, but the original church was rebuilt, and this is what it looks like today. Now, Stalin did stress the family. Divorce laws were tightened, childbearing was encouraged, and there were a few other positives. There was full employment, productivity did grow, free tuition in schools and scholarships at university, state medical care, old age pensions, illness and accident insurances, and equality for women. During these years, Stalin had remarried. He married a childhood friend, Nadezhda Alilulina. She was a friend from his youth. They had 2 children and adopted a third. Meanwhile, Stalin, his son from his first marriage, Yakov, had come to live with them. Now, Stalin was hostile towards him, and nobody really knows why. Stalin was not hostile towards his other children. Some years later, Yakov wanted to marry a young girl, but his father forbade it. In a fit of desperate depression, Yakov shot himself in the chest, but he missed his heart and he survived. Stalin would say, "Look, he can't even shoot straight." As for Stalin's wife, Nadezhda, she would argue with him frequently due to his constant flirting and his affairs with other women. After one party where Stalin argued with her and later humiliated her by bouncing a piece of food off her head, she left the party, and later that evening, alone in her room, she shot herself in the head. It was November 9, 1932. Stalin didn't tell the children that their mother had committed suicide. He told them that she died of appendicitis. They would find out about 10 years later. In a future video, I will discuss Stalin's role in World War II and what Russia went through. For the moment, I'll just say that Russia's participation, or I should say the Soviet Union's participation in World War II was very, very decisive. I don't think they get the credit that they deserve. We all hate communists, but the Soviets suffered and sacrificed a lot. Let's just say that Stalin did do dealings with Hitler. He made pacts with them, non-aggression policy with the Nazis, and also with the Japanese. After Hitler betrayed Stalin, Stalin joined the Allies in fighting against the Germans. Now, Stalin's Soviet military policy during World War II was to have no retreats and no surrenders. If you look at this picture right over here, you would think that these are Jews during the Holocaust, but no, they are Soviet prisoners of war. The German Nazis looked at the Soviets as subhuman. So they were starved to death, worked to death, placed on death marches where they would walk around until they just dropped dead. Of those that survived, 2 million of them were interrogated in the Soviet Union, and half of them were sent over to concentration camps as punishment for having surrendered. And during the final years of World War II, Stalin would have the Soviet Union research and create its own atomic bomb. Within 5 years, they did. The arms race had begun. Now, Stalin's children, because he had hid their mother's suicide from them, had become increasingly distant. Vasily, the son, would grow up to become an alcoholic. And after Stalin's death, he was actually imprisoned for a while by the new Soviet government. Afterwards, he would die of alcohol-related illnesses. As for Svetlana, the daughter, she would become more and more distant, only to reappear during Stalin's funeral years later. Now, this man here is Alexei Kapler. I couldn't find a good picture of him as a young man, so imagine if he was 30. He had fallen in love with Stalin's daughter, who was 16 at the time. Stalin found out, shipped him away to a imprisoned camp over in the north, and he did 5 years of prison time there. It had been forbidden for him to come back to Moscow, but he was still in love, so he came back, even though by that point Svetlana had already married. Well, he was caught and sent back to prison to do another 5 years. When he came out by that point, well, Stalin eventually, of course, passed away, and Kapler became a film producer. As I mentioned, Svetlana would detach herself from her father. She would eventually even defect to the United States. That's her as an older lady on the right, and that's her daughter. Now, her daughter lives in Ohio. She's a Buddhist, tattooed, and she runs a boutique shop. But going back to the 1930s, Stalin's oldest son, Yakov, had by then married a Jewish dancer named Yulia Meltzer. They had a daughter named Galina. Yakov would join the forces in World War II. But against Stalin's orders, or you could say, or policy, Yakov ended up being surrounded by Nazis, and he surrendered. Now, the Germans would offer Stalin an exchange of prisoners so they could send his son back, but Stalin refused twice. So Yakov eventually was sent over to a concentration camp. And there in the concentration camp, even though stories vary, all indications seem to indicate that one day he just ran against the electric fence, electrocuted himself, and then was shot by the Nazis. He had committed suicide. During this time, Stalin had Yakov's wife imprisoned. She did a couple of years in prison. When she got out, her own daughter, Galina, by that point had gotten distant from him. This is Galina right over here in this picture. Now, the word Holodomor means man-made famine. The peasants in Ukraine, many of them rebelled against Stalin's collective agricultural policies, so Stalin punished them. A lot of the food, the little food that they did grow, was taken away and sent to other regions. If you look at this picture right over here, there's a man laying down on the floor. He had starved to death and dropped dead. Between 4 to 6 million Ukrainians died in a man-made famine, punishment from Stalin for not obeying his policies. After the war, well, the arms race with the United States had begun. It was the beginning of the Cold War, high tensions between both powers. The Soviet Union had extended its dominion over Eastern Europe, and it had also exported its communist policies and theories over to other countries, most notably into China. If you look at these posters over here, there is Stalin standing next to Mao Zedong of China. This is Latveria Bering. He is Stalin's head of the secret police. He was in charge of imprisoning anybody who was even remotely suspicious of being disloyal to the Soviet Union. Beria was also a sexual pervert. There is a list of names of women who he personally had raped and many who he had strangled and buried in his garden. There's a list of names that will be released in the year 2028, and the names of victims number over 357. And Beria was in charge of this next atrocity. This is a gravesite in the mountains of Poland. Soviet Union had invaded Poland, and 22 military officers were massacred and buried in the forest. This is a monument in the Katyn Forest, and this is another monument to the victims that was built in Baltimore, Maryland. Under Stalin, 27 million Soviets died in the war years alone. They died of war, famine, and disease. Millions more would die under his policies of censorship, and it's hard to say how many of them were victims to Stalin or just casualties of his policies. And Stalin's paranoia would only get worse. It would reach absurd levels. Example in point, in his final years, he became extremely suspicious of doctors, especially Jewish doctors. He thought they were trying to poison him. So many doctors were rounded up and exiled or put in imprisonment camps. A couple were executed. Then one night on March of 1953, Stalin was alone in his bedroom, and he collapsed. He had suffered a brain hemorrhage. Some believe he was murdered. We'll never know. So what can we say about Stalin? Well, he determined much of the course of the 20th century. He had strengthened and stabilized the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had become a major world power, an international and economic power to be reckoned with. He was also a mass murderer to an unthinkable scale. Some say that more died under Stalin than under Hitler. Well, that depends on whether you consider casualties of famine and prison deaths part of the equation. And perhaps it's not even a sensible argument to have. Nevertheless, millions died, and that is all we can conclude. The Soviet Union would dissolve in 1991 and become Russia again, but the communist system did last 70 years. Stalinism had a lot to do with its longevity, and at a huge cost. Well, that is it. In my next video, I'll discuss other dictators and the prelude to World War II. But in the meantime, this is Cool Talk. Comment below, or better yet, subscribe.